Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, November 4th, 2010. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Chris Colby, editor of Brew Your Own magazine, and I talk about collaborative experiments and winter brews. We talk about finishing up an experiment in progress and starting a brand new one, and I hope that you will take part as well. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. You can find me on Twitter at Basic Brewing, all one word. On Facebook, I am at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james. And you can find our show at facebook.com/basicbrewing. Thanks to everybody clicking on our Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you the show, and we definitely appreciate your support. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site, too. And the list goes on and on. You can find our iPhone app in the iTunes store, and we're on the BlackBerry podcast directory, too. And our Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing DVD and our 2011 Brewers Logbooks are both being printed this week. We're rushing headlong into Christmas season. It's a race to the finish, so I hope to have them online in the store very soon. So stay tuned for that. Here's a less commercial note, probably more worthy of your time. Brian in Waconia, Minnesota, is asking for your help. Brian is a member of the Jack of All Brews Brew Club. He says Emma, the daughter of one of the Brew Club members, has been diagnosed with neuroblastoma. Northern Brewer, he says, has set up an ingredient kit called Emma's Ale to support Emma and other kids with this disease. And also a fund has been set up, too. And you can find out how you can help by going to jackofallbrews.org. That's jackofallbrews.org. Terrible news, but it's good to hear once again about homebrewers coming together to help one of their own. On a less serious note, I asked last week what unusual ingredient you've used to prime your beer, and I got some responses on our facebook.com/basicbrewing page. Rick says he's used peppermint candy for a holiday ale, and he's waiting to see how that turns out. He posted details about how he did it in his comments on our page, so check that out if you're curious. I'm curious to see how it comes out as well. Bill says he's used sucanat, and it works well for Belgians, he says. He says it has somewhat a molasses rummy thing going on. That sounds tasty. He says he's used both for brewing and for priming as well. Then there's this from Myron in Iowa. Myron says, a long time ago, my brother-in-law was telling me about a story about his father. He would make beer in the basement and would prime by putting a single raisin in each bottle before bottling. As a little kid, watching what his dad was doing, one time when his dad was gone, they put a lot of raisins in the case of bottles. His dad was very mad when his bottles were exploding. And Myron says, I don't know if he ever figured out what happened. Nice. Just helping Dad out in the basement there. Extra raisins in the bottles. Appreciate that. Thanks, everybody, for the info. You can read more, and you can add your comments as well on our Facebook page, facebook.com/basicbrewing. Now, we're short on time this week, so let's get to our discussion with Chris Colby. It's time to put on our lab coats, everybody, and talk collaborative experiments. Well, Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
James, thanks for having me on again.
You're practicing your Boston accent.
Yeah, I'm terrible. I'm not even going to do it when it's being recorded. It's so bad. A wicked pisser.
But you haven't developed a Texas accent, as you've been living near Austin down there. You don't sound like a Texan.
No, I don't. I never develop an accent where I go. I don't know what it is. I would love to be able to just burst into a good Boston accent whenever I wanted to, but no such luck.
Well, we are not here to talk about your impending move up into the Northeast, although it would be fun to do so.
Mm-hmm.
We're here to talk about BYO BBR experiments and winter seasonal beers. And let's start talking with a note from Clifton in Florida. And you may remember, if you listen to the podcast on a regular basis, that we did an aging experiment where we aged beer on the primary yeast for an extra couple of weeks to see if it made any difference in the beers, or if it ruined the beers. And we hear from Clifton in Florida that he says, I tried my first really big beer, and two, in fact, an Imperial Stout and a double IPA. The double wasn't really so double at an ABV of only 6%, but the Imperial Stout lived up to its name with 10.6% ABV. I also tried leaving it in the first primary better bottle for an extreme length of time to see if I derived any off flavors from the leaving. Not any off flavors, but there were completely different beers. The IPA had no hop punch left, and after the extreme stay, and the Stout had much less body. To show you how extreme it was, he put both in the primary on the 6th of June and only took them off this past weekend for Halloweeny taste testing, he said. So you would expect the IPA to lose hop flavor over that time, or at least I would. But it's interesting to say that for him to say that the Stout had less body. What's your reaction, sir?
These might be interesting observations, but it's the fact that he's comparing an IPA to a stout. I think it would be a little bit hard to draw the conclusions. I mean, what you'd want obviously was to have the stout, broken into two carboys and then one left on the yeast and the other not. So it's always hard when you have a single observation. You want to, it's okay to make them, but it's hard to read too much into anecdotal evidence like that.
Well, he said neither was up to the ones kegged at normal time. So I'm wondering if he did split a batch, and keg half of it at the normal time and then leave the other. It'd be interesting to hear more details, but I'm wondering when he talks about less body as well. I'm just wondering about carbonation levels too.
That could be it. If the beer sat there forever, it maybe just in bottle condition as well. The most interesting thing was that it was on primary yeast since the 6th of June, both of these beers, and he didn't report any nastiness. Yeah, that's interesting.
So that was my takeaway from that. From that, that adds evidence to our conclusion that keeping your beer on the primary yeast for an extended period of time won't necessarily ruin your beer.
Yeah, you would expect from what you read in some sources that if you left a beer for 6 months on, you'd expect it to taste like Vegemite or something, but apparently not.
Well, so thanks to Clifton for giving us that update.
Yes.
Anything that we can hear that bolsters our current beliefs is always welcome. But no, seriously, if you do leave beer on the primary yeast and it comes out nasty, tell us about that too, because we're always looking for evidence one way or the other. But we have a couple of more experiments to talk about. One is one that is supposedly in process or in progress, but I have to admit that I haven't administered it very well, I don't think. And that is the aging the beer in different temperature environments to see how it affects the quality of the brew. So what we did was we asked people to put a beer or put some beers in the attic, put some in the basement, put some in the fridge, and then taste them periodically to see how they change over time in those different environments. Did I sum that up basically?
Yeah. We were looking at storage conditions and the we strongly suspect that given all we know, that storing your beer properly is going to have a difference in how well it tastes. But the experiment was sort of to determine the extent to which, and I think we're going to see some very clear and interesting results in that one.
Yeah, I think so too. In fact, we did a tasting 5 weeks into the experiment, and my beers one was up in the attic, which I put a thermometer up there, and it gets up to like 120 degrees in the attic in the summertime. And one was in the basement, which is a little cooler than room temperature. And then one was in the fridge. And we recorded that. And I have the beers ready for another observation. And I think I even have some extra ones that I could send to you as well so that you could taste along. But very interesting. And I know that there are at least a couple more people doing that experiment out there. And I wanted to mention that because the form is now online. If you go to basicbrewing.com/experiment, you can enter in your data, and we will give you a deadline of November 20th. Is that what we said?
Yes.
Give you a couple of weeks to input that data so that we can take a look at it and we can do our final tasting and we can report the results. So I'm looking forward to that. And I apologize for not being more on top of that, but we kind of ran 2 experiments concurrently, and then it was summertime, and then we were off, and we were traveling, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it was an easy experiment to do, so hopefully you won't be too mad at me for for not being on top of that one more. But we have another experiment, and I want to thank everybody on Twitter who suggested topics or subjects for the next collaborative experiment. There were some really good suggestions in there, and I'm going to keep note of those so that the next time we come looking for an experiment, we'll have some ready to go. But what we decided on is something that is advanced for this is for, unfortunately, for extract brewers. This is for all grain brewers only. And what are we going to look at this time, Chris?
This time we're going to take a look at the impact of different lautering techniques on beer. Our proposed experiment, which I will put up on my blog on byo.com, is basically brew 2 batches of beer, or you can brew more if you want, but 2 batches of beer, same ingredients, same recipe, same, everything. But on one, you will do, say, fly sparging, regular sparging of the grain bed, and on the other, you will do either batch sparging or do a brew in a bag, or you could do a no sparge batch, or any of the common lautering techniques that homebrewers do. And you can really pick any 2 of these. You could do batch sparging versus brew in a bag if you wanted. But I think we're mostly trying to get traditional fly sparging versus an alternative method of lautering as the core of the experiment.
And what are the variables that we want to keep the same? We want to keep the same ingredients, the same amount of grain, the same boil times, the same addition times, same fermentation temperatures. Really, the only difference is going to be in the mash tun or whatever vessel. If you're doing brew in a bag, you're going to be mashing in the kettle. But keeping everything the same except for how you use that grain, right?
Right. Everything the same except the experimental variable. And the one, I think the big key to this experiment is going to be to collect the same amount of wort. Because you're gonna have the same grain bill exactly, same grain, same amount in both of the experimental trials, and you want to make sure that you get the exact same amount of wort from the 2 of those.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the easiest way to do that would be to do the fly sparging last, because you can, whether you're doing brew in a bag or no sparge or batch sparging, you can brew your first batch, see how much wort you collect, and then when you do, the traditional continuous sparging method, just stop when you get to that point, and then you'll boil the worts the same amount of time. and as you said, hop additions and everything else. So, I mean, basically do everything, as similarly as you possibly can. Do it, exactly the same, with the exception of, the time between when the mash ends and when the boil starts. Your lautering time. That's when the experimental variable comes into play. And then obviously we're looking for our big, data point we're looking for is, the difference in how the beers taste. But we'll also look at some things like color. We'll definitely look at we can look at differences in original gravity. So this is a nice experiment because you can get there's some very objective things that we'll be able to record, differences in original gravity, along with some of the more subjective things like taste. And so even if the beers turn out tasting relatively the same or hard to distinguish, we'll have the numbers thing from the OG thing should be an interesting piece of information that we'll learn.
So when you're collecting your wort, make sure that between the batches that you're brewing, you collect the same pre-boil volume.
Right.
And then should they take a gravity reading at that point before boil, or does it? They should probably take readings.
Both.
Yeah, take readings at that point. I would say take readings at several points in the process, so that we can kind of see how the experiment shapes up. See how the process is shaped by the two different methods.
Right. And when you read the experimental protocol on my blog, and also on the form that we'll post to fill out, we'll spell out which variables like to keep track of. But definitely pre-boil, volume and gravity will be one of them.
Now, can you give us, for those who are just getting into all grain brewing, can you give us like a Reader's Digest description of each of the techniques that we're talking about? Say fly sparging. Let's start with that.
Sure. Like fly sparging, also called continuous sparging, is sort of, basically what most commercial breweries do. Not every last one, but probably the vast majority. And that's just where when you're running off the wort, once the mash is done and you're running the wort to the kettle, you add sparge water at least roughly the same rate that wort is coming off the grain bed. So basically, you put hot water on top of the grain bed, and hot wort comes out the exit, and you balance those two rates so that water stays, a layer of water stays on top of the grain bed at all time. For batch sparging, which is a popular homebrewing alternative to that, after the mash, you just open up your valve and you let all the wort run out, so that the level of liquid falls below the grain bed, exposing it all. Then you stir in a second dose of water, sometimes recirculate, and then let that run that wort off, and the two worts that you collect by running the water completely through the grain bed make up your beer wort. Brew in a bag is probably the simplest, or at least one of the simplest ways to do this, and in that you have a huge like nylon steeping bag essentially, and you steep the grains in your kettle for the prescribed amount of mash time, and then you just pull the bag out and then start heating the wort. And there's a couple little variants on that. You can have enough water in your kettle so that when you pull the bag out, you're at your pre-boil volume already, or you can mash it a sort of more normal thickness and just add a little bit of water to the kettle to bring it up.
Mm-hmm.
But brew in a bag is that way. And then no sparge brewing is basically you do a thin mash where you've got essentially your entire pre-boil volume of liquid in the mash tun let it mash, then just run it all straight to your kettle, and go from there. And these are all things that the people do practice for one reason or another. For obviously, like the brew in the bag is very convenient. You've eliminated the need for a mash in a louder vessel for one thing. Like no sparge and batch sparging are typically very quick, because you don't with continuous sparging you're supposed to go slowly rinse the sugars from the grain. But in batch sparging and in no sparging, you've got all the wort is at the same density right then. It's already, all the sugars are either dissolved into it or not, and so you can just run off the wort as quickly as possible. So there's advantages, disadvantages. There's reasons that people do it. There's equipment differences why some people do it, and we're just hoping to test between the traditional method, the one that is most often used in brewing on a commercial side, and some of the homebrew variants out there that are popular.
One of the things that you will probably want to take note of is the water to grain ratio, don't you think? The mash thickness, because
Yep.
that's one thing that is kind of in contention, is that a lot of people don't like the thought of brew in a bag, especially if you use all the brewing water, because you can have I've had doing brew in the bag, I've had mashes as thin as like 3 quarts per pound, which when I first started researching all grain brewing was like unheard of. Don't do that, because you'll get a beer that's so thin you won't like it. So take note of that when you're doing it. If you're unfamiliar with brew in a bag specifics, look in our archives. I did a show last year, I think, maybe, with a couple of Aussies who are experts on brew in the bag brewing, and so look that show up. Also, the most common question I get about brew in the bag is, where'd you get the bag? And so what I will do is, in the description of this episode, I will post a link to Andy Sparks' store, thehomebrewery.com, just because that's where I get my bag. And there's a picture and there's a description there, so that you can ask your local homebrew shop where to get a bag like that, or you can just buy one from Andy. And I think it's that bag is mostly used in winemaking, if I'm not mistaken. But it's just a nylon bag, about as big as a big pillowcase, and it works real well. So I think that what I'm going to wind up doing is do the brew in the bag first, because then I can get my starting volume and use that as kind of a benchmark. And then what I'll do is probably do batch sparging, because that's what I use mostly. And batch sparging, it's easy to get a target starting volume, because what I do is I figure my mash thickness to be where I think that my first runnings will be about half of the starting volume. And then what I do is I run the first runnings out, and I use a dipstick to check the volume in my kettle. And then what I do is I heat up, enough strike water for the second runnings to equal my starting volume, if that makes sense.
Sure. And also sort of interesting although we're doing lautering methods, there's also a setup for some of these lautering methods, like our initial, in some cases, if you're doing brew in a bag versus batch sparging, your initial mash thickness is also going to be different.
Yeah.
Because that's part of the whole, brew in a bag program versus the whole, batch sparging.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas if you do, say, traditional sparging versus batch sparging, in that case, you should be able to have your, the mash in the traditional sparging will be the same thickness as at least the first batch sparge.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. People are going to have lots of different approaches to these things, and it'll be interesting to see the results that they get. I mean, I'm interested myself because I love both brew in the bag and batch sparging in my big Rubbermaid cooler for different reasons. The last beer that I brewed was a fairly big Belgian, and I didn't want to do brew in the bag because I didn't want to lift all that heavy grain out of the kettle. Even though I hang it up on a ladder strut to drain it, I just didn't want. I wanted to do my back a favor, and so I just did it the traditional sort of batch sparging way. So anyway, we'll give a deadline. What we were talking about, a deadline of January 8th. So plenty of time, and you got the holidays in there, so we didn't want to mess with your family schedule or have your family schedule mess with the experiment. So that should give you plenty of time. So January 8th is the deadline, and we're going to stick to that. And I promise that I'll pay more attention to this experiment than I have been the bottle aging experiment. But I'm excited. I think that's going to be a fun one.
I think this is a good one, and it's certainly one that if you read the online brewing forums, I mean, people argue all the time about which is better, what the effects are, but it'll be nice to see some actual experimental, side-by-side results, and hopefully interested all-grain brewers will see this as an opportunity to, really make a contribution to, home brewing science.
Yeah, and I hope that people won't sort of bias themselves toward their favorite method.
Yeah, that's always a problem. We're going to need to explain science to a lot of people that it's not about proving that you're right. It's about testing to see what the.
Yeah,
it's always
Yeah, I'm going to prove that batch sparging sucks.
Although generally the people who can't understand that and advocate for positions versus wanting to test them, generally they're lazy enough that they're not going to go through the hassle of doing the actual science. So there's a bit of a filter there. If they just like working their gums, that's easy. Science is hard. So there's.
You're trying to rile people up into actually doing the experiment, aren't you?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's probably enough of that, but I think it'll be a good one. Let's talk about winter seasonal beers for a couple of minutes. There's an article in the upcoming Brew Your Own magazine by Gordon Strong, who knows a thing or two about brewing, I think, probably.
Grand Imperial Poobah of the BJCP.
He wrote an article called "The Beer Who Came In from the Cold: Winter Seasonal Beers." So
actually, it's not called that.
Oh, okay.
You've got the original manuscript. I think
the article that was originally called "The Beer Who Came." Behind the scenes at BYO magazine.
It's called something brilliant like winter seasonal beers now.
Wow.
Great descriptive.
Yes, just strip the imagination right off of that.
Yeah, I want that.
So when we talk about winter seasonal beers, how do they differ from any other time of the year beers?
Well, winter seasonal beers are, less of a beer style than just sort of a catch-all category for any beer that's brewed, to celebrate the holidays at the end of the season. There are some similarities in a lot of them. A lot of dark ales tend to get brewed as winter seasonal beers. Quite frequently, spicing is added, but that's not always the case. I mean, one of the most famous, seasonal or winter seasonal beers is Sierra Nevada Celebration, and that's essentially a strong, pale ale or an IPA. So it's, you really sort of have to look at winter seasonal beers one by one, and you can't really make any sweeping comments about it as a style because it's just what the brewers want to make to celebrate the season, and it's very frequently, there's some idiosyncratic beers, especially with trying different, spicings. Like every year, Anchor brews their special holiday beer, and it has a different, set of spices. And a lot of the breweries, it's just sort of a big, dark, spicy ale is what many American craft breweries go with. But
Mm-hmm.
there are examples of all kinds of different things. Some do a Belgian style beer because that can be quite nice. A lot of times it's more of an English style ale. They're all over the map.
And Gordon says that the English have a different approach from the Americans. They go more subtle.
Yeah, that sort of follows when English brewers versus American brewers in almost all respects. American IPAs are a little bigger and bolder, and yeah, American craft breweries tend to push the limits a little harder on the winter beers too. Although that's something that difference may be going away in practice too. We've got beers, or I'm sorry, you've got breweries over in Europe now that are very much sort of doing the sort of innovative craft brewing that the U.S. Craft industry started.
And then packaging it in stuffed animals.
Yeah. You're thinking of the same brewery I was.
Taxidermied animals.
Taxiderm, yeah.
Real dead animals. There are 5 recipes along with the article, and they look like they're all pretty much on the dark side, and they're not all high gravity. But that seems to be sort of a common thread with especially American winter or seasonal or Christmas beers, is that they're kind of dark and big and chewy and spicy. What are some tips that you can give us if we want to? Let's start with the base. If we have, say, if we want to brew a nice, rich, dark beer, what are we looking at?
For your base beer, one of the things that I think many brewers, should first think about, of course, is how the beer is going to be spiced. Is this going to be a beer that simply uses hops, or are you going to use hops and other spices? So you need to think about that. But with regards to the grain bill, if you're making, sort of a, darkish, bigger beer, a couple places to start with, might be looking at traditional beer styles that you enjoy, either that are that big, or that you can bump up the gravity a little bit, or you can just wing it. Like find some malts that you like, get and just give them a try. A lot of times when I first started at home coming up with recipes on my own, not following style guidelines, not following anything, I would just, if there was a malt that I particularly liked and wanted to, feature in a beer, I would sort of look through a lot of different recipes that contained that malt, see how much, as a percentage of the grain bill it was in all those different ones, and then make a decision, from there on how much to add in mine. Did I want to bump that up a little bit and really feature it? Did I want to bump it down and just have it be more of a minor contributor, that sort of thing. So, I mean, when you're making your grain bill for winter seasonal, you can brew anything, so it's hard to give any concrete, instructions. But, basically you're shooting for, in most cases, a slightly stronger a beer than normal. A lot of times they're dark, so find a nice mix of dark grains, and that's about all you can say, really.
And in Gordon's recipe, he adds honey and molasses, among other things. You can add honey and molasses and other fermentables like that, but you got if you're looking for kind of a rich, thick mouthfeel, you got to be careful if you're adding a bunch of say, honey, for example, because it might backfire on you, right?
Well, honey and a lot of those things are 100% fermentable. So when you're adding them, like the contribution they make to the original gravity, one way to think about it, it's not going to make that sort of the proportional contribution to the final gravity. So if you want a big-bodied beer, start with a grain bill that's big enough. And generally, for a lot of these beers, you're going to want to, if you're thinking thick and chewy as the body, mash it at the high end of the saccharification range. Probably at least 154 or higher. All the way up to 162. Mash at that temperature and louder, hot enough that it doesn't drop, down, and especially like in your kettle, don't let that drop below because you'll just undo everything you're shooting for in the mash tun. And then on top of that, if you add honey or any of those sugars, they'll just ferment away, and then they're not going to steal body from your existing beer, but they're just not going to add anything to it.
In this first recipe, Gordon adds cinnamon sticks, nutmeg, vanilla bean, allspice, cloves, coriander seeds, and nectarine peels. So it sounds delicious, but you've got to be careful when you're adding a bunch of spices because, in my experience at least, you can get carried away, and then you've got liquid potpourri rather than a nice, subtly spiced beer. What are some tips that you can give on using spices?
Well, the nice thing about these recipes in this article is he combed through the BJCP archives, and all these are winter beers that won a best of show at a big contest. So the spicing is the beer's winning best of show. It's probably a pretty good spice mix,
Yeah.
But yeah, in general on spicing, I would say there's from whenever I used to judge at homebrew contests, one of the things I used to do is I would get sort of purposely ask for the spiced beers or the sort of unusual ingredient beer categories, and so I taste a lot of spiced beers. And one problem that seemingly a subset of brewers had would be to just sort of, like you say, just start throwing everything that you've got in the kettle. And when you're spicing beer, I would say you should have, it seems obvious, you should have some sort of idea of what you want the beer to taste like. Just blindly stirring in your wife's spice cabinet into your beer is probably not going to result in a good mix. And some places to look for various spices are of course commercial beers. If you try one and you say, hey, this is good, take a look on the label. A lot of times they'll give the spicings. Like actually Anchor is very secretive about their beers, but a lot of other craft breweries, when on their winter seasonal, it'll say right on the bottle, this is spiced with this and that. So if you see a commercial beer you like, that can give you a hint. Beyond that, just in cooking, there are sets of spices that a lot of times work well together that are, show up in recipes. And that's, if you like that kind of food and you think that kind of spicing would taste good in your beer, picking, sets of that, like nutmeg and allspice, tend to go together quite well. And, so spice combinations that work in cooking are very likely to work in brewing. It's not guaranteed, but it's a pretty good shot. And also, I'm always, I'm a big proponent of, or not a big proponent, but I think it's always worth thinking about if you're going to make a spice ale, find like one spice you really like and, make a single spice beer with just a nice, go find, some nice, fresh, flavorful spice of that kind and, go with that. Like a couple years ago, and I forget where I was at some craft brewery. It was winter and they had just a cinnamon spiced beer and just cinnamon. And it was really nice because it was, it wasn't overdone, wasn't over the top. and there was enough cinnamon in it that you tasted it and you're like, oh, there's cinnamon here,
Hmm.
but you weren't like, oh, cinnamon. I'm gonna drink half a glass of this and then, order a pale ale to wash it away. Um, so it's always, whereas a lot of Christmas ales tend to have more than one spice. It's worth at least considering, uh, you know, brewing a single spiced ale. But I mean, certainly don't. I'm not saying don't brew a multi-spiced ale, since obviously as a recipe show, you can go ahead and win best of show. But it's always, it always pays to consider what you're shooting for and having a target rather than, um, like I said, sometimes at some contest you just wonder what if people were thinking.
Well, this past year for our annual holiday barley wine that we do on Basic Brewing Video, which reminds me I got to get started on this year's, but I did a small batch, as I do every year, and that may be a good advice, is to do a small batch if you're going to play with spices. But what I did was I looked at the recipe for a fruitcake. And so I took all the spices from that fruitcake, and I even put some toasted walnut or toasted pecans in there, chopped up into the boil, and also candied fruit, just to see what would happen. And it was only 3 quarts. So if I completely screwed it up, nothing lost or not much lost. And it actually turned out really well, and I'm looking forward to tasting it this year to see what a year of age will do to this beer. But when I put all the spices in the kettle, I thought, oh my God, I really screwed this up, because it did smell like I was sticking my face in a big bowl of potpourri. But it turned out well, shockingly enough. So that may be a good piece of advice if you're playing with spices that you've never used before and you don't really have a recipe. Try a small batch before you venture into making a big, high gravity, 5 or 10 gallon batch of beer that you'll never want to taste again in your life. But these things also, the spices change over time, and the beers can mellow or evolve over time. So this may be something that you want to keep on hand year after year to kind of check in on as a part of your holiday tradition.
Yeah, and also another trick you can do when you're brewing spice beers, spices can be added at various times in the beer. If you're brewing one where you're adding the spices in secondary, after the boil, you can ferment your beer, then rack it to 2 different carboys, split it, spice one of the carboys, and then taste it later, and then use the beer from the second carboy if needed to sort of blend down the spicing level.
That's a good idea.
And you can, I mean, if you really like, if the base beer is going to stand alone, that's great, because then you have the spice version and the other. If not, you can do something like, and you really want to end up with the entire volume being the spice. You can, say rack 4 gallons if you're doing a 5-gallon batch to, a carboy for spicing. Rack 1 gallon to a gallon jug as the hold back. And, if you're doing the spice in the secondary, just wait until, sample the beer, wait until the spicing is just a little higher than it should be, then use the blending beer to blend back up to volume. And also you can also do that if, you can also go to the hassle if you're brewing, and the spicing's in the kettle, you can go to the hassle of brewing, an entire separate batch of beer without it. Although that's, most people aren't willing to put in that amount of work.
Yeah.
But if you happen to have another beer on tap that's similar, like if you're brewing a dark ale and it's spiced, and you happen to have, like a foreign export stout on tap, and you end up, slightly overspicing your winter beer, you could use, your available, somewhat similar beer to blend down, at least small amounts of overspicing.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, because spices are hard to, as everyone who's ever brewed a spice beer, more than a couple times knows, spices are sometimes they come across very strong. Sometimes they don't come through. And, the spice itself, depending on when it was harvested or the growing conditions, and especially how it's been stored, might be, strong or weak. Like a teaspoon of cinnamon is going to be different in a batch where you've gone to like a place that has very fresh ingredients, and put a teaspoon of cinnamon in your beer versus if you pulled out like supermarket cinnamon that's been sitting, on your shelf for 7 years. Yeah. A teaspoon of cinnamon versus a teaspoon of cinnamon are going to be two very different things. And so you've got to, and especially if you try to brew year after year and hit a sort of consistent benchmark, you have to plan for different strengths of spices.
Well, the key is, I guess, is just to have fun, right? I mean, it is the holidays after all, and you are a home brewer, so you can either follow somebody's recipe or use that as a jumping off point, or just come up with something on your own. And it's just a part of the whole holiday fun experience. And you've got time.
Yeah, that should be the nice thing is that, a holiday beer, there's no hard and fast rules. You can brew, you could brew anything. Maybe you like Imperial IPAs, and maybe your holiday brew is going to be just an Imperial IPA, or maybe you want to go the big dark ale with, a mix of spices, or anything, a Belgian-y beer, you can do whatever you want, and it's it should be and is for a lot of brewers, a platform to show your creativity, and this is a good a great time of year to brew something interesting. It's a great time of year to give the gift of beer, as it were. A lot of if you I've found even after being a home brewer for years, when I give beer to like my family or friends or whatever, they're like, oh, beer, this is great.
Well, I'm off to plan the next holiday barley wine. So just go off, have fun, and make a good beer. I appreciate your time, Chris.
Thanks, James.
Thanks again to Chris. If you click on the BYO banner on our site, you can get a free issue of the magazine. And if you decide to subscribe, you'll be helping to support this podcast. And thanks to everybody who has done so. And I hope you'll take part in our new experiment. I'm looking forward to it. How will the different methods of mashing and lautering stack up against one another? I'm interested to find out myself in a side-by-side comparison. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Our new DVD is on its way, Extract, Brewing, and Partial Mashing. And our 2011 Brewers Logbooks are coming soon, too. So check out our online store from time to time, and I'm sure I'll be tweeting and Facebooking when the new stuff is in. In the meantime, you can check out our other DVDs, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits as well. We've got combo deals to save you a few bucks. And you can check out our Basic Brewing shirts in the store, too. And you can also see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Willie Nelson, Willie Vintage T-shirt, and You Too Can Yodel. Yodel. Thanks again, everybody. Remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We appreciate your support. Don't forget, we also have associate links for the American Homebrewers Association on our page, too. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer, production help for Basic Brewing Radio, and our website is provided by our buddy, Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.